Hey everyone, today I had the absolute pleasure of sitting down to talk with Tim James, who is the author of two of my absolute favourite science books, Elemental and Fundamental. You might have heard me talk about them on my channel before. I've definitely quoted Elemental. If you follow me on Instagram or Twitter, you will have definitely seen me posting little extracts from his book Fundamental as I was reading it. He is a fantastic science communicator. He takes these really big, complicated topics and explains them so simply and so easily. And he was kind enough to sit down and have a chat with me a little bit about how he writes his books, how to communicate efficiently, and he gives some great advice for anyone who's looking to go into writing, into creating, into science. He's a wonderful person, and I cannot thank him enough for being a part of this video with me. I will leave links to all of Tim's books down in the description below. I'll also leave links to his social media and his blog, so you can go send him loads of love and support. He is the nicest person, and yeah, just a huge thank you to him for making this video with me. Alright, so thank you for joining me today. I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about science communication and the best ways to kind of take these really big complicated topics and make sure that kind of everyone can understand no matter their background, their education, and you're really, really good at doing that. So I thought...
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. I'm just going to be throwing compliments at you throughout this whole thing, so get used to it.
I'm not going to stop you.
I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you about is, can you tell us a little bit about the two books you've written so far and what inspired them? How did you decide on those topics?
Okay, so the first book, which is Elemental, because it's about the periodic table of elements, where that came from was I noticed that there weren't really very many light-hearted, easy-reading, fun books about chemistry. Most of the books that are out there about chemistry are either textbooks or quite rigid academic, histories of the periodic table. And
they're quite dry, aren't they?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I thought, why not? Why is nobody writing a book about the weird stuff? Because chemistry is such a bizarre subject. It's so interesting and varied, and there are so many cool things. I mean, when I'm not writing, I'm a secondary school physics and chemistry teacher, and the things that make students go, this is kind of cool, is the weird experiments, the stuff that is kind of strange. So I thought someone should write a book that is focusing on the weird, fun, lighter side of chemistry. So I wrote that, and that's what Elemental is about. And the second book, the publisher sort of said, we quite like Elemental, what else have you got? And for some reason, I'm still trying to analyse why I said this. I said, I'll do one on quantum physics, which is perhaps a little bit of an ambitious topic to have picked for a second book. But I kind of thought, wouldn't it be interesting to take this topic, which is known for being complicated and known, it has a reputation for being strange and bizarre. And I think everyone who's heard of quantum physics kind of thinks, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I think everyone who's heard of it knows, well, that's kind of weird. And I thought, let's see if I can write a light-hearted, non-technical guide to quantum physics. And so the title was Fundamental, because it's about fundamental particles and the fundamental laws of physics.
And also it's really fun.
Well, I was this close to making the subtitle The Fun in Fundamental Particles, but I was stopped before I could get to that level. I was
That's why you have editors.
This close, Rachel, this close. And so that one was a real passion project, actually, because I love quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And so that one was kind of, I was really writing from, it sounds incredibly tragic, but I was writing from the heart when I was writing about it, because I was writing about something I really care about. And that's sort of what inspired Elemental and Fundamental. The overall inspiration, though, is to try and write books in which I take the science seriously, but not myself. So to kind of write books where the science is explained as accurately as possible and to kind of hopefully show people why it's cool, but without becoming, elitist and becoming, sort of, oh, I'm the science professor, trying to be kind of down to earth and fun about it. So take the science seriously, but not myself is my, I guess, mission statement, I suppose. So that's where the ideas came from.
I love that. You do absolutely kill it. I feel like, unlike a lot of kind of science writing, you don't forget the human aspect, if that makes sense.
I think Yeah, I think it's really important to tell the stories
Yeah.
of who these scientists were. So, I mean, so for example, in Fundamental, I talk about Werner Heisenberg, who came up with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and there's so many interesting stories about this man. For example, in his Viva interview, he was asked how a battery worked, and he didn't know because he was such a theoretical physicist. He had no idea how batteries worked, and we're talking about a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who couldn't explain how a battery worked. And I think it's really important, as you say, to humanize it, to remind people that all of these science facts haven't come from, boffins in lab coats. They've come from real human beings with senses of humor, with foibles, with character flaws. And it's fun to kind of tell the story of the people. And I try to do that in Elemental and Fundamental, talk about who were these people? Why did we decide this is the case?
I really love that. Like, I actually found myself talking about your book at a party the other week. So there's this guy who was...
What kind of party was this where it was appropriate to talk about chemistry and
cool
quantum
kind of
physics?
party.
Okay.
We were all very cool, and it was, like a bunch of rappers and models, and
Obviously.
yeah. I
have never been at a party where someone says, "So Tim, tell me about quantum mechanics." That's yet to happen.
Well, there was a guy there, and I think he's doing his PhD in something to do with like quantum physics, and so he mentioned that, and I was like, oh, just read a really good book about that, and I could actually have this basic conversation with him just from reading your book, and we understood each other, and it was amazing.
That's really flattering, actually. That's exactly what I want to do. I want to kind of help people understand what the basic rules are, so that they can have a conversation. That's brilliant. I'm really glad it worked. Thank you. I feel like I've ticked something off there. That's the aim, to kind of give people an understanding so that they can have these conversations. That's fantastic.
It's seriously, I'm someone who I haven't done physics since I was 16, so it's 10 years or so now. It was GCSE last time I did it, and I was good at it then, but it's been a long time. And so if someone said to me, read this book on quantum physics, I'd be like, no. I just wouldn't think I get it. But yours is so accessible and understandable, and just that kind of brings me on to the next thing I want to talk about, because what do you think are the key ways to be a good scientific communicator? How do we communicate those big ideas to make sure that everyone can understand them?
I think the first thing is to want everybody to understand them. It's to not be elitist about it. I think that's a mistake some people make, is that they think sort of science is for the preserve of us. We are in the bastion of knowledge. I think the first thing is to kind of want everybody to get it, to want everybody to know what you know. So kind of assume that everybody is curious, assume that everybody is up for it. And the second thing, I think, is to have fun and to be a bit silly with it, to kind of tell jokes about it. In Fundamental, there's a chapter called "How Quantum Mechanics Proves I Am Batman."
I love that.
Thank you. And the whole chapter. So what I'm really doing in the chapter is I'm kind of teaching, what we can use quantum physics to do, but I'm trying to do it in a silly, playful way. And so I think that's really important. So have fun with it and want everybody to get it. I think don't show off. Don't go in wanting to show off. Go in wanting everybody to get it. And I think that's the really important thing. Have fun and want everybody else to enjoy it the way you do.
So another thing I kind of wanted to say, I don't know if this is going to be flattering or not, but what I first thought when I first read Elemental was that, and Fundamental as well, they're kind of a more grown-up version of the horrible science and horrible histories books I read as a kid.
That's very high praise. They're great books.
They it properly reminded me of that, because they're the kind of stuff that it goes into that human aspect, it goes into the funny, silly stuff, it kind of goes into the gross stuff.
Yes.
And I was wondering were there any books like that inspired your writing, or kind of you felt helped you be a better kind of communicator?
It's a very good question. The horrible histories books and horrible science books are fantastic sort of books. As you say, they're kind of wacky books, and they're kind of written for 8 to 11-year-olds, that kind of thing.
I cannot wait to buy them for my nephew. I'm so excited.
Exactly. And I thought people don't suddenly lose their sense of humour or their interest in the quirky stuff once they hit adolescence. You don't suddenly think, I want the boring stuff. So I suppose in a way, it wasn't that the horrible histories or science books inspired me, because it's years since I read them, but I suppose I was trying to channel that, but for an older audience, so for teenagers and adults. So were there any books that inspired me? I mean, my favourite, the greatest science writer of all time is Isaac Asimov, and I will have strong words with anyone who disagrees. And Isaac Asimov's mantra was be clear. He said that's the key thing with explaining science, is to just be clear about what you say. And in his books, he isn't afraid to put silly stories in and puns and witty asides. And some people find his writing style a bit sort of smug, I think, and I can understand why. But he kind of mastered the light-hearted, let's just explain the science and let's kind of have a bit of fun. So he'd tell the funny stories at the same time. So the writing of Isaac Asimov probably had more of an impact on me. In terms of what else inspired me, this is going to sound very kind of cheesy Disney, but the things that have had the most impact on me have been science teachers I myself have had. So my secondary school chemistry teacher, a man called Mr. Evans, my A-level teacher, a man called Mr. Miller at university, a guy called Seishi Shimizu. These guys very much enjoyed what they were doing, and they enjoyed science, and they wanted everybody else to get what they knew. And they all did it in the same way, which is to kind of break things down, to start with something very simple that everyone can agree on, that there's nothing complicated about, and then just slowly go step by step from that, explain all the new key terms as you're going along, explain the jargon. So it sounds kind of like inspired by my teachers, but I really was. And also my father as well. My father taught me from a very young age to ask questions. Don't be afraid to, you take a Exactly. You get a fact, because science isn't just about answering questions, it's about questioning answers. So my dad was always very keen on, well, this is something that we know, but how do we know it? How sure are we? Does it always work? Does it work in every situation? Where does it break down? And that kind of got me thinking, I should never take any fact for granted. So if I'm taught something, oh, this is how atoms behave, for example, you have to think, well, why is that the case? How do we know that? Who discovered that? And I think that's kind of what has been the biggest influence on me is people who encouraged me to have fun and to ask questions.
That's so sweet. Like, I kind of agree with you. Like, I had this science teacher when I was in, it's year 7 now, and I still remember him. His name was Mr. Hawkyard, and he was amazing. He was this like really eccentric man with these big bushy eyebrows, and he was just so excited about chemistry. Yeah, exactly. He was he was amazing. He always reminded me of, did you ever watch The Demon Headmaster?
No, I'm afraid not.
Oh my god, it was this like terrifying kids TV program, and he always reminded me of the headmaster in that, who was a bad guy. But he was like the nice, friendly, like teddy bear version of him, and he was so sweet. And yeah, so
this show was called The Demon Headmaster.
Yeah.
I don't remember. Awful.
Yeah, no, it was. I don't remember the details now, but it was this guy, and he was like, he ran a school, and he would like hypnotize the pupils and make them do all this like terrible stuff. Which, sounds really dark now that I'm older. Program. Yeah,
that's traumatizing.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah, that's the opposite of what I want to do. Scare children away from teachers.
So yeah, probably don't do that, I guess, would be your advice. Yeah.
Thank you for the tip.
But as a teacher yourself, how do you kind of foster that love of learning in your students?
Oh, that's a very good question. I've been teaching chemistry and physics for nine years now, and I wish I had some golden nugget of advice that I could give to other teachers. I'm afraid I don't. The only thing I can think of is what I've already said, which is to show the kids why you love the subject. Show the kids why you love it. And if you go in and you make it clear to them how much you enjoy what you're doing and how much you enjoy talking about science, then if you're lucky, some of them will do it as well. The other thing that's really important is to want them by the end of the year to be smarter than you are. You want to finish it not being the cleverest person in the room. You want one of them to, or ideally all of them, but you want them to go away and read about it and learn themselves to the point where they know more about it than you. And that's kind of the goal. So again, show them that it's fun, show them why you love it, and want them to know it better than you do.
Do you ever find...
That's it. That's all I've got.
All right, interview over. That's it. I'll see you later.
There we go.
Do you ever find there are students who, like, I remember when I was back at school, I was always quite into my science and stuff, but there were a lot of people who were maybe artistic or musical that didn't think science was for them. They didn't think it was something they could do. How do you kind of, like, not tackle students like that, but How do you kind of help them and communicate with them?
Absolutely. I think if someone is passionate about something that isn't science, I think that's great. I think it's important to have a passion. It doesn't matter whether it's science or something else. I mean, obviously, I want everyone to be passionate about science because that's what I love. But as long as they've got something that they're passionate about, I can usually, if they're passionate about art, then I can kind of convey to them, well, the way you feel about art is how I feel about science. It's just something different. And all you've got to do is tap into that passion that they have. And because I don't want to kind of persuade them away from the arts or something, because if they're really passionate about that, great, good for them. But hopefully get them to recognise that, oh, I really love the paintings of Botticelli, for example. Mr. James seems to love the second law of thermodynamics in the same way. And that's kind of what you've got to do. So I don't want to dissuade anyone away from their passion towards science. I mean, obviously I do. Obviously I want everyone. Yeah. I want everyone to be a scientist.
If you could, you would do the hypnotizing thing. Yeah.
Yes, actually, that makes a good case. I should hypnotise people into loving science, really. Okay, that show now sounds quite good. But yeah, I think it's just, as long as they've got something that they're passionate about, you just kind of have to say, okay, that's fine. You love football or playing guitar or working on cars or whatever it is, that's fine. I love science. I'm going to share my knowledge of science with you. And if I'm lucky, you'll get infected by that. If I'm lucky, you'll catch the bug. That's kind of how you've got to approach it. You can't persuade everybody to love what you love because everyone has a personality, but get them to appreciate why you love it, I think.
Do you find it helps to do kind of like crossover stuff with other subjects? So when you do find something that people are passionate about, it's going to sound really stupid, but I love my comics and I love DC and stuff like that. So that was kind of one of the reasons that I found Fundamental, chapters of that, so easy to read, because you had these comic book references in there and silly little things like that, and it kind of made me more engaged and interested. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with a lot of the videos on my channel. So I have this Science of Beauty series that I'm working on, and so it's kind of I imagine if I was at school and we had to learn about something like lipids, which are kind of not boring, but it's a bit dry. If someone had said to me oh, well, there are lipids in your makeup remover and this is how they work and this is, what happens and this is something you're using every day. And there are a lot of girls in my school who are really passionate about makeup and things like that. And I feel like if it had maybe been taught in that way rather than just here's a picture of a lipid and a dry textbook and this is what it does in science and this. Do you think science classes need to be a little bit more, I guess not necessarily inclusive, but do you reckon there could be more crossover with other more artistic subjects, do you think?
I think so. The quotation that's currently popping into my head is Rosalind Franklin. And Rosalind Franklin said, science and everyday life cannot and should not be separated. So for her, for Rosalind Franklin, it was that science can be found in everything. You can find science in every walk of life. And so I think there really isn't in there. As you say, the makeup example is a very good example. So you can talk about, how makeup works. Why does it stick to the skin? How come makeup is or isn't water soluble? For example, a few years ago in the chemistry syllabus, I'm not making this up, in the chemistry syllabus a few years ago, we had to talk about the chemistry of drying paint, which is a topic famously which has the phrase, it's as boring as paint drying. And so as science teachers, we're all sitting there thinking, right, I've got to somehow get them to care about paint drying. And so you think, okay, well, how do I do this? But actually, there are some interesting questions there. So if you paint a wall, does it matter? Does the thickness matter? Does it dry from the bottom up or from the top down? Does it dry from the outside or the inside out? And what exactly? Suddenly, you're like, actually, that is an interesting question. So even paint drying, I think everything is interesting if you look into it in enough detail and you ask the right kinds of questions.
I'm thinking of other ways that could be applied now. So if you're painting an actual picture, are there certain things you have to do in order to get it to dry evenly or things like that? Nail varnish,
precisely.
How different materials dry and what affects it. Yeah,
exactly. And right there is sort of what you have to do as a science communicator, is to find out, okay, so there's this particular esoteric thing that I want to talk about. How on earth do I get that to be something that other people want to know about? So for example, I've just written a book about the periodic table and quantum physics. Those are not subjects which at first glance seem like they're relevant to everyday life. How on earth do those two link? And that's kind of the challenge. And kind of the fun is thinking, how can I make people care about the periodic table? How can I make people care about the Higgs boson? How do I do that? How do I get people to see how that is relevant to their day-to-day lives? And that's the challenge.
To change the subject a little bit, not that paint drying isn't interesting, but I kind of want to touch on something a little bit more personal now. And you know that in a lot of my videos, I'll get criticism for certain things, and it's different when you're on video. But I'm sure you get some negative reviews sometimes.
Oh yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Well, I think when I get sort of criticism, I kind of remind myself, especially with the internet. So there's about, the last estimate I knew, there's about 3.2 billion people use the internet. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of personalities. Guaranteed.
A handful.
Guaranteed. A percentage of that is not going to like what you do, and guaranteed a percentage of that group is going to feel the need to tell you about why they don't like it. So I just kind of remind myself that, well, everybody's there's always a bell curve, and if people do like my books, great. If people don't like my books, fair enough. I mean, sometimes I get emails from people who've noticed a factual error, and that's actually quite useful. So in my first book, in Elemental, there's one page where I talk about the number of electrons, which are particles that go around the outside of atoms of carbon. I get the number wrong. I must have just been very tired when I wrote that section. That's really useful criticism, because I can then go to the publisher and say, for the next edition, do that. But if people just want to write, so if people want to just write in and say, I don't find your jokes funny, I have to kind of think, okay. I just think, okay, fine, that's okay. You're allowed to. So yeah, that's how I kind of cope with the criticism, to kind of remind myself that there's always going to be people who don't like what you do, especially when you put something out there in the public. Some people aren't going to like it, and that's fine. That's how I cope with it. You know.
Sounds really healthy, actually. I could do with a little bit of that. I'm actually I'm starting to learn that I can't please everyone, and for a long time I've been trying to, and it's difficult.
Well, you've got, as I say, so especially on the internet, which is where you do your stuff, you've got about 3 billion people out there on the internet, and every human being is walking around with 86 billion neurons in their head, arranged in so many different ways. Everybody's brain is different. Everybody's going to like different things.
Yeah. What do you say to the people who think that, you should take science a little bit more seriously? Because there are those elitist people who,
It's a very good question. I would say that I am taking science seriously, and seeing the funny side of something. The opposite of funny is not serious. The opposite of funny is somber, and they are very different. You can take something seriously and also see the funny side of it. That doesn't mean you don't suddenly take it seriously. In fact, I think it actually, in a way, is taking the subject more seriously to recognise the flaws and the silliness of it, and to find these quirky little parts of it that make you go, oh, that's kind of them. So I think if people were to tell me to take the science seriously, I would say they probably haven't actually read the books, because I would hope at least that it comes across in my writing that I love what I'm writing about. I really love science.
It does.
And thank you. And I think you're allowed to enjoy something and take it seriously. As I say, the opposite of funny and lighthearted is not serious, it's somber. And what I don't want to be is somber. I don't want to be kind of quiet and let's talk about electrons and what they do. I can still take it seriously and say, electrons are weird and awesome. I can still take it seriously. So that would be my answer to that criticism.
To go back a little bit more, talking about science communication in general, how do you kind of manage the fine line between being clear and simple and being patronizing?
Right, that is a brilliant question. That is very, very difficult to get right, because you want to explain something in a simple way so that someone who has never studied before can walk away knowing it. So with my books, I want to say, okay, let's take a person who doesn't know anything about the periodic table, doesn't know anything about quantum physics, and knows it by the end. But how do I do that without sort of dumbing it down? I think the trick is to think about the reference frame of who you're talking to. So, for example, let's say an A-level student comes to me and asks, why is the sky blue? I will give an answer to them that recognises that they're familiar with A-level physics. They'll probably know what photons are. They'll probably know about Rayleigh scattering, Mie scattering, light dispersion, wave superposition. So I can give an explanation that fits their worldview. If a 5-year-old child asks me, why is the sky blue? I can't use the same vocabulary, I can't use the same jargon, but that doesn't mean I have to dumb it down. I can still give an honest answer. I just have to be very careful about what I'm saying. So I think you have to, first make the assumption that the audience is not dumb. And I think that's really important. If someone is buying a book about quantum physics or chemistry, they're clearly not a dumb person. They're clearly a sharp-minded individual who wants to learn. So I start by making the assumption that the person I'm writing for is clever and curious, but not necessarily educated in the same things that I'm educated in. And that's kind of how I do it. So before I send the books off to publishers, I usually send drafts of it to a sort of friends of mine who aren't science experts, who don't say have a degree in science, but they are still kind of bright and curious, and their feedback is incredibly useful because they will come back and say, right, this all made sense apart from chapter, you're dumbing it down, or you're going too fast. So I think it's really important to have people in your mind, and I always imagine an intelligent person reading my book who hasn't, say, studied this subject at university, but it wants to know it anyway. And that's I think, the key. I would feel terrible if people read my books and found them patronising. I'd feel absolutely terrible about that. I would really feel bad about. If people don't like my silly sketches or my silly humour, that I would kind of shrug up and think, okay, well, that's fine, it's a matter of taste. But if people said I'm patronising, I think, oh no, that's because I really don't want to do that. And it is really difficult to find that line. But my guiding principle is assume they're just as clever as me. They just know something that I don't. That's kind of how I personally try and handle it, and it seems to be working, I think. The feedback
I definitely think you do it well.
Thank you. Yeah, the feedback I've gotten from both books has generally been very positive, which is really nice. People say really lovely things about it, and you get so many people who say, oh, I never really got chemistry at school, but I always wanted to, but I get it now. And that's really gratifying as a non-fiction author to know that you've done that.
I found that there's a lot of people who like when I post like extracts from your book and stuff, they're immediately like, oh my god, I didn't understand this before, but I get it now. Or like, oh, I need to read this book and find out more. And I think that's like really nice. I don't think me, just like
when
everyone
you post
else.
This, you'll have to edit out all the bits of you saying my book's really good and me going, oh, well, thank you, like awkwardly.
Yeah, I know. I don't want people to actually go out and buy it, do I? Oh. Do you think there are any topics that are like too complicated to dumb down for the general, not dumb down, but like to
explain in a clear way.
Yeah, for like the general public, because quantum physics is a big one.
So there's two things to say on this. The first is the quotation that's coming to my mind now is from a theoretical physicist in America called Leonard Susskind, and he writes very technical but clear books so he writes kind of books, physics books with the equations left in. They're called the Theoretical Minimum series. And if you're not afraid of kind of doing a bit of the maths involved, they're really great. And he says people aren't afraid of challenge, they just don't want to be bored. So he says it's fine to write a book about a challenging topic as long as you don't bore them. And now, according to him, there is one topic he can't think of a way of explaining to the general public, which is why string theory, which is a branch of theoretical physics, requires higher dimensions for it to work. So string theory doesn't work in 3 dimensions of space, it needs higher. And he's said that that's the one thing he can't think of a way of explaining in a non-mathematical way. Now, I find that really encouraging, that this guy, Leonard Susskind, who is a brilliant theoretical physicist, if he's saying there's only one thing he can't think of a way of explaining non-mathematically, that's really encouraging. I've always felt, as a teacher and as a writer, that pretty much anyone can learn pretty much anything, provided it's explained in the right way and they are motivated to do it. And that generally serves me quite well as a teacher. I mean, I've come across students who don't want to learn and aren't interested and aren't motivated. Okay, fair enough. So they're not going to learn, but that's because they're just not interested. And I've come across topics where they haven't learned it well because I've not explained it very clearly. But I think if the person really wants to learn it and you explain it in the right way, I don't know of any subject that I would be afraid to explain to someone. In fact, that's kind of why, after writing Elemental about the elements, that's kind of why I picked quantum physics, because I thought, well, what's the most like notoriously difficult thing to explain? Let's pick that and write a guide for non-experts. And it clearly worked, because if you can then talk to an actual quantum physicist and application, it's clearly served its purpose there. So that's kind of why I picked it. So with the exception of possibly this high-dimensionality thing, I would say no. I think you can explain anything to anyone if you explain it right and they're motivated enough. So yeah, I think people are generally clever. I think.
I think people have different ways of learning, and you just need to find the right way to explain it to them. It might take some people a little bit longer. It might take some people doing something rather than just hearing it. For me, I need to read something and make notes to really take it in. Like, just hearing something has no effect on me. So, I don't know. I don't think there are any dumb people. I think there's just
I think it's very important as a teacher that I believe that it would be very dangerous if I walked into a classroom and assumed that some of my students
you're dumb.
That would be an awful way to handle the job.
Yeah.
I think exactly. You've got to kind of think, you know what? Everyone in here can get what I'm doing. I've just got to find the right way. Yeah. If they're not motivated or they just don't care, at that point you kind of hit a brick wall. There's only so much you can do. If they're just like, I hate physics, I hate chemistry, I'm never going to like it, then, okay, fair enough. That student I am going to struggle with. I'll do my best and try and convince them that it is interesting. But yeah, if they want to learn and you talk to them carefully and find out how best they learn, you can do it. I think
that's such a great attitude. So changing the subject a little bit, because I want to end on a nice kind of light, happy note. Just a couple more little things. Science books. What books would you recommend to anyone watching now? Like science-based, non-fiction based. What books do you enjoy? What do you recommend? That kind of thing.
Other than my own.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend
them. Okay, so obviously I've already name checked Isaac Asimov. Definitely read anything by him. So I must say, if you want a bit of a challenge, I recommend the books of Leonard Susskind. He's kind of, you have to really work hard at his books, but they are so worth it. Another great science writer who's around right now is a guy called Ben Goldacre. He writes books.
Yeah, I know him.
Yeah, he writes books more about the methodology of science and scientific thinking. His books are great. My favourite living science author is probably a guy called Robert Sapolsky. He writes biology books. And I probably love them because I don't know as much about biology. And I just love his writing. And I think he's not as well known. Which I think is a great. Okay, so some of Robert Sapolsky's books: A Primate's Memoir, The Trouble with Testosterone, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, Behave. Those are some titles. I highly recommend those. Yeah, I highly recommend those. They're cracking books. I would say those are some great authors. If you want a fiction author, I would recommend is a guy called Neil Stevenson. So he's some of his great books, Anathem and Seven Eves, I would recommend. They are sci-fi books, but they're sci-fi books which focus on getting the science right. And there's whole chapters of them which have detailed descriptions of the science. So if you want a fiction book that is a heavy read but teaches you science as well, I recommend Neil Stevenson would be another good author to look at. So those are some of the great authors. But when in doubt, Asimov. When in doubt, go for him. You don't ever go wrong with Isaac Asimov.
That's great, thank you. I will put links to those in the description below if people want to check them out. And finally, what bit of advice would you give to anyone watching who wants to create science-based content, whether it's to write a book, to go into scientific research, to make YouTube videos? What advice would you give them?
I would say the most important advice is to read everything, not just the genres that you already like. Because let's say you're really interested in 13th century tapestry weaving, and you go and buy a book on 13th century tapestry.
Yeah.
Exactly. You're already going to like it, even if the book is terrible, because it's a subject. What you need to do is go out and read books in every genre and find books in genres that you didn't originally like, but that persuaded you. So go out, read all those 100 books you need to read before you die. Read the works of the classical Greeks. Read Renaissance poetry. Read fiction. Read non-fiction. Read science fiction. trashy horror. Read books on gardening, read everything, and what you'll find is you'll come across books that are not in genres you originally realized you liked, but they will make you go, wow, that's interesting. I had no idea that 14th century dressmaking was so interesting. And when you find that book, study that and look at how that book does it and how that book gets you excited. So if you're wanting to write books about something that you're passionate about, read stuff that you're not passionate about and see what hooks you and see what draws you in, and study that and see how that kind of does it. So read as a matter of self-respect, because you'll absorb how language can be used to communicate ideas. So yeah, that would be my advice. Just read everything you can.
That's amazing. Thank you. I gotta say, like, I completely agree. So I did this thing, it's back when I was living in Oxford, so maybe like 5 years ago now, where I set myself like a reading challenge for the year. And I gave myself these like 50 challenges. And I had to, pick books to read that fit these things. So it was things that I'd never really done before. So it was like, read a play, read something by an author from this time period or this country, or do this. And
exactly.
It was amazing. It expanded the type of books I read so much.
Yes.
And I found all these amazing things that I loved. You
discovered other things, don't you?
Yeah, it was so good. I feel like...
And that's really important.
I feel like it's the same thing with YouTube videos. If you want to start making YouTube videos, don't just watch people in your genre. Watch lots of other people. So I watch a lot of like kind of commentary channels and people who do like video essays and things like that, because I like to understand their like presenting style and their editing style, and I'm always picking up tips like that.
You can magpie the ideas, can't you?
Yeah, exactly.
You think, well, that works for that. I mean, I did have a YouTube channel, but I don't really know what I'm doing with YouTube, so I don't really have much advice on how to make a good YouTube channel, because I don't know how to do that myself.
Are we not going to do a collab on paint drying?
No, that's the next one. I mean, I have done a few videos, but I'm not really I don't really know what I'm doing there. With writing, I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing a bit, so I can give advice on that. I don't really think I would know, but I actually say it's probably the same. Just study everything. Study what other people do. If you want to write a good book, you have to read great books first. You have to see what the real champions of the field have done before you try and do your own version. You've got to know what a good one looks like, I think.
Did you have any failures before you wrote these two books?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah? Oh, for sure, yeah. So the first book my agent and I approached a publisher with, I realised that sentence sounds incredibly... Oh, my agent. I know how smug that makes me sound. But the first book we approached was actually a children's book about... scientific questions of everyday life. So what is fire made of? Why do dogs wag their tails? Why is the sky blue during the day but black at night? Questions that children have. And so I wrote that, and they weren't interested. I proposed all sorts of book ideas, like, maybe a book on this, and they were like, no, we're not really interested. Maybe a book on this, no, we're not really interested. Oh yeah, definitely. Plenty of books I tried. I suggested a book on evolution. I suggested a book on the science of death. Was one that I proposed.
Have you read
but they did
Stiff by Mary Roach?
No, I haven't. I've heard of it. I've not read it though.
Sorry, just been like, someone already did that, mate.
I'll add that to my Christmas list. That might be why they rejected it, actually, because they feel like, someone's already done that, which is fair enough. So yeah, no, definitely, I've had loads of failures, and you do, again, I suppose actually another piece of advice for anyone who's wanting to write is you've got to. Your ego has to take a bath, because people are going to savage what you write, and you are going to have editors telling you this bit's terrible, and you are going to have people saying change this, and you've got to kind of take that on the chin and listen to it. So when an editor says this chapter does not work, you can't get confrontation and say, well, I think it works, or well, you didn't understand what I was going for. You've got to kind of say, okay, fair enough, why doesn't it work, how can I make it better? So yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I've had plenty of writing failures before it started working.
All right, well, that's pretty much everything I want to talk about. Do you want to end this by plugging any of your social media or your books or anything like that? Go on, bit of shameless self-promotion.
Shameless self-promotion.
Yeah. The best kind.
I'd say if people want to read a book about sort of chemistry, then read Elemental. If you want to read a book about quantum physics, then read Fundamental. So yeah, go out and buy my books.
You have a blog as well. Do you want to?
Oh yes, so I have a blog. My website is timjamesscience, all one word.com. And I have an Instagram which is Tim James Science. So if you just Google Tim James Science, you'll find me.
That's how I found you. I'm a stalker like that.
Clearly it worked.
It did actually. Like no, I mean like because I got this interview. I'm not like actually
just very
stalking
slowly
you.
easing my finger towards the hang up button. I'm gonna
yeah.
go.
Sorry. Yeah, no, but
Why were you Googling the words Tim James Science out of curiosity?
Oh, because I read your book and I liked it, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna message him so I can quote him in a video.
Oh, I see. Oh, I thought you meant before you'd read the book. I thought you meant you were sitting there one day and thought, you know what's an awesome name? Tim James. It is an awesome. I think Tim James. You know what's an awesome subject?
Yeah.
Science. And then boom, you discovered my stuff.
Yeah, that's what I did. Yeah. No, I found your book in a local bookshop, and I was like, oh, that's a pretty cover. And I picked it up, and I was like, oh, this sounds fun. And then I read like a bit of the first chapter. I was like, oh, I'm going to buy this. And I bought it and read it, and here we are.
Yeah, I've discovered in the publishing industry there is so much effort goes into designing the cover, so much debate goes on, even things like which letters in the subtitle to capitalize.
Oh yeah.
People go for weeks and weeks debating it. Yeah, I cannot claim to have actually designed them, but the person who designed these books did an amazing job.
They are beautiful.
They look way cooler than my writing deserves. Like, I look at them and I say, damn, that looks like a proper professional book. This is for my silly books. Like, they actually look like real things. So yeah, I was very fortunate. The publishers I work for are just amazing. The guy who does my copy edits is just superb. You know, they're just really, really, really great people.
Sweet. I'm glad you got a good team behind you, and you're working on some new books, aren't you?
My desk editor, my agent, they're just fantastic people. I'm very, very fortunate.
You're working on some new books, aren't you? I don't know if you can say anything about what they are, but
I'm afraid not.
Something.
No, I'm not at liberty to discuss that in great detail.
But people should just be prepared and buy them when they come out.
Yeah, my joke is that the third book is going to be called Dental, and it's going to be about teeth. That's my kind of. Yeah.
That's probably not one I'd read.
About the brain.
Oh, I'd read that.
Well, there we go. So, yeah, no, I can't really go into too much detail at this point because the third book is currently, through this thing, and we're currently talking about fourth books. But it's the same kind of thing. It's take a topic in science that people want to learn about and explain it in a light-hearted, easy-to-read manner. So that's always my goal.
So, I think that is pretty much me done for questions. You plugged your books, so I think all that's really kind of left to say is to encourage people to go out, buy your books, go fully on Instagram so they can find out about your new books, and just give you lots of love and support, really, because you deserve it.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's been a pleasure being on your channel.
Thank you so much for doing this. I think people are really going to get a lot out of it.
Thank you for the interview. It's been great fun.